Hi, everyone. I hope you are doing well as best as you can be, all things considered. I know that we had a little bit of an interruption to our course, so I wanted to create a little talk for us to start to think about some of the ideas that came up in the week 1 and 2 readings in preparation for our week 3 discussion. So these 3 weeks together form the basis of Module 1, which is all about how do we know in qualitative research and the history and the foundations of qualitative research. So the main things that we are focused on in this module are how knowledge is produced, justified, and used in qualitative inquiry, as well as some of the ethical and political consequences of knowledge claims that we're producing, and then also considering how researchers' stance shapes what becomes knowable. So this discussion in weeks 1 and 2 will be the foundation really for the whole semester, but then especially for our week 3 discussion, which is on experience as knowledge. So what do we mean when we talk about qualitative research, and what are we rejecting when we use a qualitative paradigm? So as we read in Denson and Lincoln, qualitative researchers really stress the social constructed nature of reality. And so when we think about qualitative research, we're not talking about a specific method like interviews or a methodology like narrative inquiry or ethnography. Instead, when we talk about qualitative research, we're talking about a particular way of knowing and making a claim about that and operating within a set of assumptions about what it means to know in that way. And so, as such, in this qualitative way of knowing, typically it is assumed that interpretation is important and instead rejecting neutrality. It's important that meaning is made in context instead of an objective, distant stance. And knowledge is situated. It's not a universal, constant, or variable that is generalizable to everyone across time, and that inquiry is value laden based on the researcher and not detached. And as such, qualitative research is always shaped by values of the researcher, of the participant, of broader society, power, again, of all of those interlocking dimensions, and the purpose of the research. So within this, it's rejecting this stance of a view from nowhere or this neutrality as an ideal, and not seeing qualitative research as a weakness, but instead operating in a totally different paradigm. So, of course, this stance has been contested, as you read in the text this week. So, historically, the qualitative research is operating in response to a particular set of research practices. So, these historically dominated research traditions are largely grounded in a positivist tradition that also has assumptions, even if they're not as discussed as qualitative inquiry. It's still operating on a set of assumptions about objectivity, the possibility and the of having a distant relationship, and the possibility of having universal truths. And so the result of these assumptions is that knowledge is produced about people rather than with them. So qualitative inquiry emerged as a response against this by centering lived experience, reflexivity, and representation. And with that comes out this sense of qualitative research being operating within a set of contradictions, tensions, and hesitations as these two opposing views come together. And so out of this comes the metaphor of the bricoleur, which has to operate not with one set of tools, but a variety of different tools in order to deal with, sit with, and to work within this tension. And one of the things in this article that really stuck out to me was about the shift and the pushback against qualitative inquiry and how that aligns with standardization in education and some of the movements that we've seen starting in the early 2000s to now for standardization and the type of research, and then now the type of instruction that counts as valid. So speaking of the bricoleur, that is the metaphor that is discussed in the Denson and Lincoln article and in many other articles. But it's important to think about the metaphor that you are using about research, about the researched and the researcher, because these metaphors really function as an epistemic stance or reveal some hidden assumptions within your epistemic stance. So when you imagine research and the researcher, you can start to think about how that metaphor represents knowledge, how it's produced, who the researcher is, and then also who the researched is in relation to the researcher. And so in our textbook, Venus Evans Winters offers the metaphor of the mosaic, which has very rich epistemic assumptions with it. So she posits that qualitative research is this process of piecing together fragments that are in relation, putting them together, interpreting. However, with that, we can assume that knowledge is partial, that it's situated, and that it's assembled. And so as you engage in the readings, you might start to notice other metaphors, or you might think of other metaphors that you have heard that seem familiar or might even be problematic. And that came up in the text as well. A lot of the dominant research talked about excavating knowledge from a participant, even using the terms subject and object kind of convey certain epistemic meanings versus informant or participant or co-author. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about metaphors that might be resonating with you. So as we saw in the text, each author offered sort of a map for how to conceptualize the research process and caution us to not start with methods, at least not start with methods without interrogating what is underneath or behind them. So Crotty offers this visual, and similarly, Esposito and Evans Winters offered this visual. So Crotty, of course, collapses ontology with epistemology, and Esposito and Evans Winters separate it, but say that they're okay with the collapsing as well. And then we have the research process from Denson and Lincoln, which starts with the researcher who that component encompasses many of these different philosophical components. And so in thinking about this, we can start to see how different research epistemologies and theoretical perspectives make certain questions possible or limit the possibility of certain questions, and how they inform methodology by making certain methods possible or not. So there is some compatibility in there that comes up. And again, it's related to the assumptions that go into that epistemological stance and that theoretical position that shape how you can enact this to craft research in response to. So knowing that qualitative research begins before methods, we have epistemology, what makes knowledge possible, the theoretical perspectives, how you see the world pieced together, and then, of course, the researcher stance, where, how, when you are located, and these later inform methodology and method. And in the text, they also mentioned that the qualitative research process, despite those linear visuals, is not a linear process. And so you might start in one place and circle back. So you'll often hear qualitative research referred to as iterative or recursive. And that's because you're constantly negotiating with yourself, with the world, with your research participants, the assumptions that are informing your study. So when you try to isolate your epistemology, the assumptions there, the theoretical perspective, the stance, you might find that you can understand them better when you consider them in tandem in an iterative cycle. So as you start to think about this and formulate your stance that you will take into your research, start to think about what you assume is true about the world and what you assume is true about how knowledge is produced. So knowing that qualitative research is built on these foundations of assumptions about knowledge that control or limit or make possible what can be seen as legitimate or important or worthy of studying. It's always important to think about how qualitative research takes place I'm sorry, how qualitative research takes place within a specific socio-historical and socio-political context. And so that again speaks to the socially constructed and situated and evaluated nature of qualitative research, which is important to consider because in qualitative research, the assumption is that when you understand and you interpret evidence and knowledge claims in this way, these claims become consequential for whose realities count and resisting some stances that discount certain realities. And this pushes us forward towards intersectionality as an epistemological frame in understanding that neutrality itself is a particular standpoint. And so going back to the emergence of qualitative research, why it was necessary, and how there are a lot of unspoken assumptions with neutrality as a standpoint. And instead, intersectionality as an epistemological frame, the authors remind us that intersectionality can be both a theoretical lens or framework and also an epistemological position. And as an epistemological position, it shapes what questions are possible, expands what counts as knowledge, and reinserts and reorients power in knowledge production. And this is seen as a way to understand not just identity, but particular epistemic claims about how we can go about the research process. And so as we continue to think about how we shape knowing in terms of our stance, our epistemic stance, our researcher stance, there are at least 3 different epistemic claims we can think about when we think about what we are bringing to the research. And they all do different things. They're not interchangeable and they are not a checklist to tick off, but rather active dimensions to continuously, iteratively, recursively be thinking about. So the subjectivity, and we read an article about this, reminds us that we are always in the research. It's not this view from somewhere, this outside detached observer. And then positionality is this view of we're always located within shifting relations of power, which again is why positionality cannot just be a checklist, a statement, because it is constantly in flux and being negotiated within the research space. Again, understanding that qualitative research is socially constructed and it is nested within a particular moment in time. And then standpoint, the particular location shape what can be known, and that it is understood to be not that all epistemic positions are not knowable to others. And so it's important to consider how standpoint positions us, how we interpret knowledge, how it's taken up, and that the access that we have is negotiated under unequal circumstances. So, thinking about standpoint being much more than just an individual experience, we also read about how standpoint can be seen as collective and, of course, structural, produced through specific racist, gendered histories, locations, and relations of power. And so, with that, not all experiences carry the same epistemic weight. And so, we also read about counter spaces can help us think about how knowledge can be collectively created through our collective standpoints as a political stance as well. And so when you start to think about experience as something that you or we interpret together rather than something that you just have, you start to again disentangle and interrogate these epistemic commitments and assumptions. So, we talked a little bit about how metaphor can help you start to tease out and locate yourself and locate how you maybe unconsidered assumptions about how you're entering into research and how you might want to redirect yourself. You can also do the same thing with language. And so, particularly in thinking about the specific verbs that you're using to describe your work or your research or yourself, think about how those verbs communicate your stance and if you're okay with it. So there are extractive verbs that are often used in research from a particular stance that accomplishes a specific purpose. These extractive verbs often assume distance or stability, universalities. Then there are interpretive verbs that are relational, assume ethics, assume oftentimes equal value, thinking back to what we just discussed about standpoint and different epistemic weights. And then there are verbs that might locate you in the critical or the refusal, assuming that power is active. So here I offer just a few verbs that I've heard with research, or especially related to the purpose, to measure, to give voice, to represent, to center, examine, problematize, refuse. So if you have more verbs, either that you are comfortable with or not comfortable with, put them in the chat. And which of these verbs maybe bother you, or which of these verbs resonate with you. And as you think about this, you can start to think about what these verbs reveal about how you are approaching knowledge, what you think is possible to know, and also how you will come about it. So it's a good exercise to think about that as well. And so as we think about the verbs, we are going to move into a bit of pre-work for our next class, which is all about experience and why it matters in qualitative research and why it can be complicated. So as we have touched on a little bit when it comes to the socially constructed nature of qualitative research and standpoint, experience can be epistemically powerful, ethically charged, and politically consequential. However, it's important to interrogate experience as knowledge because experience, and this is up for debate, but in many would argue that experience does not automatically equal knowledge, and that experience can be used in different ways. It can be weaponized, it can be decontextualized. So it's important to disentangle experience and what assumptions we have about that. And Collins reminds us that experience is a starting point, not an ending point. So that's where we are going with our next discussion. And so as you are looking ahead and back at these readings that you did in weeks 1 and 2, think about, I want to trace it a little bit on your larger statement memo that is due in March about your epistemic, theoretical, and subjectivities and your stance that you are crafting. So as you start to think about that, you can think about what assumptions will guide your inquiry. So in that statement, Some of the things that you'll name are what you believe can be known and how you see the researcher's role and responsibility. We talked about playing around with metaphors there. How power shapes interpretation. This will again come up with theory, theoretical stance, what you're refusing, and what is at stake ethically. And on this little checklist, I put this reminder that even unnamed assumptions still shape your research and others' research. So that's important to think about as well when you are consuming research. And so I will leave you with this overall question that comes out of all the work that we have done in weeks 1 and 2 about what assumptions about knowledge, reality, and power are embedded in your research, as that is how you will go about framing and crafting and revising and negotiating your stance. So I look forward to your comments, and if you had any questions about the readings, do put them in perusal as well, and I will get back to you. And I'm excited for week 3.